Come have a seat. Reminds me of teaching at the University of Virginia, where students sit at the back of the room. I'm not sure why is it. Is there more protection in the back of the room?
Faster exit.
Faster exit, okay. I am Michael Krepon. I am the co-founder of the Stimson Center. The person who is the director of the Stimson Center has just had a seat, Samir Lalwani. That baton pass is, all baton passes should be so easy and so gratifying. Stimson does a lot of work on South Asia. We are very concerned about the avoidance of conflict and crisis management. And we also have a very long literary history of working on confidence building and nuclear risk reduction measures. This book, Off-Ramps from Confrontation in Southern Asia, is the last of our, most recent I should say, of our edited volumes. Our job here is to elicit really good ideas. If and when political leaders are willing to take them up. And what we've done in this project, the Off-Ramps project, and I should say that this Off-Ramps project was a collaborative effort with Liv Dowling, who's here in the front row, who has absconded to the Pentagon from the Stimson Center, and Travis Wheeler, who's one of our speakers, who has absconded from the Stimson Center to work on Capitol Hill. That's actually one of our roles here, is that we have an eye for young talent, rising talent. We nurture talent. And we are gratified when people leave Stimson to take on bigger responsibilities than we can offer. So this book, like its predecessors, is a collaborative effort. What we've done here is to ask rising talent, as well as a few veterans, to propose one idea and to lay out that one idea in a very rigid format. So all of the essays in this book slavishly follow this format. What's your good idea? Why is it a good idea? Why is it needed? And then, what are the obstacles? Of course, every good idea has lots of obstacles, which is why it's not been implemented yet. And why is it conceivable that these obstacles can be surmounted? So that's the format, and you'll get comfortable with it if you decide to read through these essays. There may be a time, if we're optimistic, there may be a time when some of these ideas might be tried out. I think the agreement by the governments of China and Pakistan to be okay with the listing of the Jaish-e-Mohammed leader on a UN list of bad guys provides somewhat of an opening, perhaps. And the possibility that after the Indian elections, the Indian government might decide to try one more time to engage with Pakistan, see if progress can be made. There have been some confidence-building measures, some nuclear risk reduction measures that have been agreed to by India, Pakistan, and by India, China. In the past, if there is a pattern, my sense is that these measures have been agreed to after close calls, crises, more to keep external pressure off their backs than as measures that are worthwhile in their own right. That could change. That could change. Because the measures are needed, we can see crises are not likely to go away between India and Pakistan and between India and China. So, how do we get on the right path? I've asked 4 of our chapter authors to offer their ideas. I'm going to recognize 2 of our chapter authors who are not up here. Toby Dalton from the Carnegie Endowment and Harry Hanna, who's sitting next to him. They both have outstanding ideas that I urge you to read about. But for now, we're going to focus on these 4 chapter authors. The first speaker will be Saleem Ali, who is the Blue and Gold Distinguished Professor of Energy and the Environment at the University of Delaware, whose colors, by the way, are blue and gold.
That's right. It's the Alumni Foundation that endowed the...
Our second speaker will be Hannah Eglin, who I am proud to say is an analyst at the Stimson Center. She's been here for 4 years now or so, and I have seen her grow professionally before my very eyes. And it's a very pleasing sight. Our third speaker will be Sylvia Mishra, the 2019 India-U.S. Fellow at New America. I think, became aware of Sylvia's skills. I think it was in Monterey, at that wonderful master's program that Bill Potter and others are running. And our last speaker will be one of the editors of this volume, Travis Wheeler, who has written about this particular problem between India and China and their border issues. So, Saleem, you're number 1.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and honor to be back at the Stimson Center. Allow me to first begin by sharing with you the inspiration for this work, which goes back many years to the time when I was a junior academic at the University of Vermont. And I had the good fortune of interacting then with the late Ambassador Harry Barnes, who was U.S. Ambassador to India and also the director of the Peace and Conflict Center, one of the centers at the Carter Center as well after his retirement. And then he retired in Vermont, which was to our good fortune, and we had a chance to interact with him and to learn from his experiences in diplomacy throughout his career. And it was a special privilege to have a diplomat take a scientist seriously. You know, as you can see from my bio, Even though I have dabbled in international relations, my primary research area is environmental studies, and I've particularly looked at the linkages between extractive industries and conflict. But during those interactions, we talked about what would be mechanisms whereby some of the most intractable aspects of the India-Pakistan conflict could be examined from the point of view of science diplomacy. And it was around this time that this term environmental peace building was gaining traction also within the defense establishment. And we held a series of meetings at the time to focus on the Siachen Glacier and see how the Siachen dispute could be resolved. It was through that process we held a series of meetings. We held one in Kathmandu, which I had the pleasure of attending with Ambassador Barnes. And that idea gained quite a bit of traction. I also got a chance to edit a volume that was published in 2007 with MIT Press, which was on the notion of peace parks, which may seem like a very idealistic notion, but it was framed in very specific examples where this could be possible. And we looked at cases where actually the environment could be used as a neutral mechanism to bring adversaries together, as a neutral means of building trust, not being too glib about the full determinism of conflict resolution, but at least providing that trajectory whereby trust could be built, and then eventually you could have opportunities for resolving the broader concerns of what is often termed high politics compared to the environment, which is sadly often termed low politics in international relations. So that's where the genesis for this idea came from. And just to share with you also that the Siachen dispute got a lot of attention at the time through this mechanism for dispute resolution. And the former Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, when he visited Siachen during his time as Prime Minister, he actually made reference to this particular idea of creating a shared environmental zone as a means of resolving the conflict, whereby there wouldn't be a relinquishment of sovereignty, but there would be a recognition that this area, for its scientific importance, particularly in the context of climate change, was so important that it could be resolved. And we have examples of that. I mean, Antarctica is a classic example. At the height of the Cold War, there was a recognition that without relinquishing claims of sovereignty, that there could be a mechanism to at least have engagement between the parties, and we hence have the Antarctic Treaty. And in many ways, from a scientific perspective, the cryospheric environment, as we call it, the Siachen, which is at a very high altitudes, and happens to be the world's longest non-polar glacier, could be looked at. So that's where it came from. Now, moving fast forward to the time when I was asked to contribute this chapter, I said, well, Siachen has been looked at, but here's a dispute which is perhaps even easier to consider because it is not directly linked to the Kashmir issue. Siachen, because of its proximity, even though its history is different from Kashmir, gets linked to Kashmir because of its proximity rather than its history, because Siachen conflict started in 1986. It doesn't go back all the way to 1947. But the Sir Creek dispute is one which is just as old, but it is one which is perhaps less directly connected and could be resolved. So the same structural issues we tried to look at and applied to Sir Creek. Now, some of you may not even know that there is such a dispute, so I'll just show you the map. So here we have, the Indus River, which is, of course, one of the world's great rivers and which gives India its name but largely flows through Pakistan, is seen here in two images. The long image of the river there flowing through Pakistan, and then there's basically a zoom in of the delta of the river. And the delta region is where the dispute is in terms of where the boundary is between India and Pakistan. And the history of the dispute is discussed in the chapter. I won't go into it. But basically, the idea was that we try to focus on the environmental conservation value of this region. And it's a delta region, it's a wetland region, and both India and Pakistan have signed on to an international convention called the Ramsar Convention on Wetland Protection. So the other structural aspect of this approach is that it is going through international legal mechanisms which both countries have actually signed on to. So it's not something new in terms of its obligations, unlike Siachen, where there was no international treaty that you could connect. So here, Ramsar, India and Pakistan are both signatories, and under the Ramsar Convention, there is a specific clause on transboundary wetlands of international significance. On the Pakistani side, actually, the wetland area has been designated a Ramsar site. On the Indian side, it has not yet been designated, but it's a conservation area. And in Gujarat state, clearly there is a lot of interest in conservation issues in that region. So it could be approached from the point of view as India and Pakistan not dealing with the other concerns they have, but focusing specifically on the ecological aspects and thereby coming to an agreement around this region where the dispute is essentially about whether the dispute is about whether your boundary is in the middle of the creek or on the banks of the creek. From an environmental science perspective, that is a very problematic dispute because this creek is constantly shifting. Delta systems are dynamic, not static, but that's what the dispute is about. So by having a shared environmental peace-building approach where you designate this a conservation area where the sovereignty itself is not relinquished, but you are able to have joint management, and you can still have a hard border on either side of the conservation area. So it's a practical approach. You're not saying that you demilitarize the area even. You just have a hard border on either side, and you allow actually for joint access for tourism from both sides of this border to allow for also Pakistanis and Indians to meet each other in what could be considered a peace zone. And you still can have this control of the border and boundary just as you would in any hard border. But you are able to thus build trust and at least put this particular dispute to rest. So that's what we've argued for. This has been done in other cases, I should mention. The United States negotiated the peace treaty between Ecuador and Peru in the Cordillera del Condor region using a very similar approach. That was an armed conflict for more than 70 years as well, but it was resolved through Brazilian and American mediation during the Clinton administration through the establishment of a jointly managed conservation area. Similarly, even in the Middle East, if you visit, and I've had the good fortune of visiting the area where the Jordan-Israel peace treaty was signed, there is actually an old hydropower station there. And both countries agreed to that being designated as a neutral zone for access. And in fact, part of that region, there is Jordanian sovereign land which has been leased out to an Israeli kibbutz. So even in the Middle East, such an approach has been looked at. So that's the approach, and I hope that it will be considered seriously moving forward.
Thank you, Saleem. Hannah.
Well, thank you, first of all, Michael, for having us up here today, but also for spending decades doing the type of work that now my colleagues in the South Asia program have taken over to make sure there's new voices and new ideas working a very troubling problem set in South Asia. I'm going to start a little bit broad and then get into my proposal. We've, I think, entered into an era where we have a lot of people that are questioning the basic utility of the purpose of bilateral and international agreements. So this doubt has spanned discussions of the NPT. We see it going on right now in the PrepCom, of INF, of New START, which is set to expire. And those have all been agreements that historically have been cornerstones of how we promote stability globally through pledging mutual restraint. And I think we're also seeing that same discussion happen around the JCPOA now and the Paris Climate Accord. And so for me, as someone who works on South Asia, this has really prompted a question of when and why is is it ever in a state's interest to voluntarily make a promise or offer information that has to do with security interests, especially on nuclear programs? And that's a pretty fundamental question. I think it's one that is coming up and getting challenged here in the US, but it's a less fundamental question in South Asia where the history of nuclear weapons is different. It's distinct. And the lessons and sort of mechanisms that came out of the Cold War for the US and the USSR were not the same. And so it's been a fun question to think about myself, but also to pose to my colleagues during travels to South Asia and when we have people here at the Stimson Center for visiting fellowships. So the proposal that I put forward in this book, Off-Ramps from Confrontation in Southern Asia, is about voluntary nuclear information sharing. It's unverifiable. It's pretty low-hanging, confidence-building measure in terms of easier, low-hanging fruit. And I wrote it as part of a multi-year project that another colleague and I here at Stimson have been working on. And the project has involved going and talking to Indians, Pakistanis, some Chinese scholars, and a few South Koreans about expanding participation in an existing multilateral mechanism. The mechanism is an information circular from the IAEA called the Guidelines on Plutonium Management. And basically, participating states for a few decades now have every year published how much of their civilian plutonium stockpiles they have. And so it's again, pretty low-hanging fruit, simple thing. But as we went around and talked to people, both here in DC and in Asia, about this proposal that I thought was pretty straightforward, why not join it? I wasn't expecting a ton of pushback. Our discussions, some of them had technical elements. Well, what would it involve, and where would India's unsafeguarded civilian materials fall? Some of them involved domestic political concerns or regional and international political concerns. But really, all of the discussions boiled down to this question of why would we ever participate in something where we're offering information voluntarily or making any kind of commitment about our nuclear program? Why would a state want to do that? And so I'm going to walk through a couple of the answers I settled on and how they apply to this very specific proposal that right now does not have a lot of political saliency, but maybe one day could, which is really the purpose of this book, I think, is to have a toolbox of some options that could go somewhere someday. So the first thing that I think nuclear information sharing mechanisms have the potential to do is they have signaling power. So they allow states to talk to one another about their intentions and about the nature of their approach to certain issues. So in the case of InfoCirc 549, the Guidelines on Plutonium Management, and some other information sharing mechanisms, it's a way to signal that you're a responsible nuclear power and potentially a good trade partner for nuclear industry trade initiatives. But it's also a way to signal the direction of your nuclear program's development. So early on, when this information circular was put into force and people started reporting, states started reporting each year, I think the second or third year after it got initiated, all of the participating states not only put out numbers on their fissile material stocks for civilian plutonium, but they also put out strategy documents or planning documents that talked about the direction and intentions of their civilian nuclear program for the next several years. And it was a way that different states, including some states that other participating countries had concerns about, like Japan, could sort of say, here's what we're doing, here's where we're going, this is our intention, here's how we're planning to use different technologies, here's our estimates of where fissile materials will be in the future. And so it really was a messaging campaign opportunity. So that's the first one, signaling intentions. I think the second thing that nuclear information sharing mechanisms can do, even when they're unverifiable, is they can affirm shared priorities. So in terms of things that all states with nuclear programs agree on, where there's some big, easy ones, nobody wants nuclear terror. Everybody wants dangerous materials to be safe. They want those facilities to be safe. So we have shared interest in nonproliferation, at least horizontally, and in nuclear security. And this is a way both to communicate that shared priority, but also to perpetuate norms. Global norms in these shared priorities. And that's something that India has expressed great interest in showing some more leadership on, and Pakistan has showed an interest in participating in. And I think that existing multilateral mechanisms like InfoCirc 549 is an easy way to sort of reaffirm that. The third thing I think that information sharing mechanisms can do is, this sounds really basic, but they can offer information. And the reason I think that's important is that in the absence of information, states are often put in a position where they will assume and then must plan for worst-case scenarios. And we saw this play out in the Cold War in some really problematic ways. So even when you don't have the formal verification measures of a treaty, that's an ideal scenario. But even without that, we have increasingly sophisticated open source analysis that is providing sort of some democratic verification in some ways. And so in the Cold War, we saw it wasn't until the emergence of satellite technology that the U.S. and the USSR were really able to enter into agreements where they could trust that the information that was being offered was verifiable. And it wasn't until after that, when this information was out there and verified, that they could start thinking about planning in ways that weren't nightmare Armageddon scenarios. And that's when we could start making commitments to scale things back. And then the last thing I would offer that nuclear information sharing mechanisms can do is a little bit idealistic, but I think history has demonstrated its truth. And that is that they can be used for other things. So any kind of line that's connecting countries or a group of countries, it usually involves some kind of relationship building potential, some kind of dialogue potential. And so when these states that participate in INFICIRC 549 meet on the sidelines of other major multilateral conferences, meetings, and talk about their annual reporting, those are spaces where states could float ideas for bigger things that they don't want at a higher level. So I think it's inherently valuable, and the more you can use flexible mechanisms, which 549 is, the more that's true. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah.
Sylvia, your turn.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you, Michael, Samir, for inviting me back to Stimson. It's always such a pleasure, and I really appreciate the platform that Stimson has been providing to young emerging professionals, both from the United States and also from the region. It's deeply appreciated. So my colleague Sarah Bidgood from the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies and myself, we were helping Dr. Bill Potter and Dr. Lassina Zerbo, who is the executive secretary of the CTBTO, write up a proposal and to do a CTBT-related event in New Delhi. It didn't happen, but during that time, we reached out to Michael, and we said that we think that it is important that both India and Pakistan engage with the CTBTO. And that's when Michael said, why don't you write up an article on that? So my proposal, along with my colleague Sarah, was essentially about India looking at the CTBTO's international monitoring system. And even though political conditions might not encourage the signature and ratification of both India and Pakistan of the CTBT at this point of time, but both countries can take incremental steps to join the CTBTO's international monitoring system, and I explain what has been the challenges so far and what India and Pakistan could gain and benefit, and there are both political and technical benefits for both the countries to join the international monitoring system. As we know, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is a multilateral agreement which was opened for signatures on 24th of September 1996. The idea was to halt nuclear testing globally. Several countries did sign to the CTBT, and whereas several countries also faced pushback. India and Pakistan both joined the negotiation during the drafting of the text of the CTBT. But as we know, in 1998, both India and Pakistan conducted nuclear weapons tests and essentially embarked on the unknown, then unknown world of nuclear weapons, and eventually in the last 20 years have had their specific and distinct trajectory when it comes to being a steward of their nuclear arsenal. The international monitoring system, which is the part of the CTBTO's global monitoring network, has 321 monitoring systems across the world. The idea is to detect nuclear test covert, which happens anywhere across the globe, right? So a lot of countries did participate in the CTBTO's international monitoring system. For example, China has signed the CTBT, but has not ratified it. And even though it has not ratified it, China hosts 11 international monitoring systems within its territory. So our proposal was, because the political conditions might not be ripe for both India and Pakistan to come together working on a bilateral confidence-building measure on the CTBT, but rather look at joining a multilateral organization, which is the CTBTO, and cooperate with the international monitoring system. We know that India, China, and Pakistan has been developing and modernizing their strategic arsenal. At the root of it, of historical differences and unresolved border issues, one of the key challenges is the lack of strategic trust between and amongst these three countries. Our proposal aimed at bolstering this strategic trust between India and Pakistan on a bilateral level if both the countries are able to function and cooperate with a multilateral organization. So I would want to talk a bit briefly about why India has had a principled stance against signature of the CTBT. India has argued that the Article 14 of the CTBT, which essentially requires 44 nuclear-capable states to sign and ratify the treaty for the treaty to come into, for the treaty's entry into force. India and India's security architects and diplomats time and again have mentioned that India's signature would be an encroachment of India's national sovereignty if India, because of the Article 14 clause. That is one. And the second, India has always maintained that it would promote treaties that looks at a complete and time-bound disarmament. But CTBT essentially has been more of a non-proliferation and a cut-off treaty, and therefore there has been a lot of hesitancies from the Indian strategic community and also the policy community to adhere to the CTBT. However, it is important to realize that one of the key issues that India has always mentioned and underscored that India's signature is linked with China and the United States ratification. In our proposal, we argue that India, being an emerging power, has been able to project to the nuclear policy world that it wants to play a role within the nuclear policy trend, should go ahead and unilaterally take a measure to engage with the CTBTO and not link its ratification with the United States and China. And for that, we believe that there are several political benefits that both India and Pakistan could derive by engaging with the CTBTO. And one of them, and first and foremost, it is important to also showcase to the international community that both India and Pakistan are responsible stewards of their nuclear arsenal. And by joining the international monitoring system, what both the countries would do is essentially also underscore that they are not willing to commit to nuclear testing again. So that is one important issue. And then the second, in a way, it also focuses on the fact that both the countries are committing to each other of non-testing. So that is another important political benefit probably from signing and joining the international monitoring system. But very importantly, there are several technical benefits as well. And because I have been participating in several science and technology conferences that is hosted by the CTBTO, we've actually met several Indian scientists and also Pakistani scientists who go to the science and technology conferences. And by speaking to them, we've realized that there is an importance of having a robust seismic network in both India and Pakistan that would also help both the countries to prepare for disaster management issues. The Indian Institute of Seismology in Gujarat, they have expressed their interest in public education and scientific knowledge and information sharing with both the CTBTO and also with scientists across the border. So this essentially also focuses on bolstering people-to-people network and cooperation, possibly amongst the scientists. And lastly, to conclude, it would be important to highlight that while both the countries are unable to join on a bilateral level, we have had examples where the grounds of South Asia has been fertile in terms of promoting CBMs. For the last 10 years, there has not been any confidence building measure, but because we have seen the recent crisis, I believe that joining the international monitoring system is a low-key, a low-hanging fruit, and this is the right time, especially in the backdrop of the recent crisis, that both the countries should engage in the CTBTO and on discussions on the CTBT, which unfortunately is very scanty and lacking in both India and Pakistan.
Thank you, Sylvia. Travis, take us to the India-China border.
Sure thing. So first of all, thank you to Michael and the Stimson Center for hosting me today. It's good to be back among a lot of familiar faces. I went to Michael when this volume was almost complete, and I said, hey, Michael, you know, I noticed that we don't have multiple chapters on China and India. Maybe I could write a chapter on that. So Michael entertained my idea, and I started writing my chapter, doing my research. I quickly realized why nobody had taken this topic up. But unfortunately, I'd already committed to writing, so I persisted. So let me say first that my remarks here today represent my personal opinions, not those of my boss or the U.S. House of Representatives. My proposal in this off-ramps edited volume is for China and India to clarify and respect the line of actual control, also known as the LAC. This does not mean that I think Beijing and Delhi are about to take my advice, but I do think it's worth highlighting the increasing costs and dangers of continued disagreements, transgressions, and incursions along the line of actual control. And it's also worth assessing the changing strategic environment and whether or not having an unclarified boundary is still in the strategic interests of China and India as we move forward in the 21st century. So here at Stimson and in the South Asia program, there's been a historic focus on India and Pakistan and all of the crises, very serious, including the recent one in February. The 1999 cargo conflict is another example of the serious crises and ongoing competition. But I think we forget about one of the other biggest sources of friction in Southern Asia, and that is this unclarified line of actual control between China and India. And a related issue is this problem of prolonged standoffs, so serious military confrontations that occur along the line of actual control, that even though there hasn't been a shot fired since 1967, increasingly we're seeing major political, economic, and strategic effects of these standoffs. And I think those warrant serious consideration. So first, my proposal. So why do I suggest to clarify and respect the LAC? Well, the main reason is because China and India have already agreed to do this numerous times. There's an existing CBM, confidence building measure regime, that's in place. Starting in 1993 with the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement, China and India agreed that they would not use force to settle their disputes on the boundary. In a series of subsequent agreements, they said they would respect the status quo of the LAC, they would avoid military exercises and other escalatory behavior along the LAC. And as you'll see, I think some of that consensus that supports that CBM regime is fraying. Another reason I put forward this proposal is I think it's really important, if not to eliminate the transgressions that occur because the LAC is undefined, to eliminate the prolonged standoffs. So more serious intentional incursions that translate into military confrontations with a serious potential for escalation. And unfortunately, the CBM regime has prevented neither transgressions nor incursions. But a clarified LAC could reduce these incursions and the pressure on the existing CBM regime. And finally, I think this proposal is worth pursuing because India and China need to think seriously about the economic, political, and strategic disruption that continues to occur every time there's a major standoff along the line of actual control. And I would also add the Doklam dispute in 2017 to that series of trends, because I think DOCLM is going to have a lot of implications for how China and India think about the LAC going forward. So one of the things I loved about this project is, as Michael said, he asked us to identify the hurdles too. It's very easy often when we have these conversations to act like there aren't obstacles, but there clearly are, and I talk a lot about all of them in my essay. Let me go over a few of them here. I think the first big hurdle is that in both Beijing and Delhi, there's a strategic impulse that's very strong in both countries, probably more so in China, that we should defer clarifying the LAC. We should defer resolving the boundary dispute because we should keep focusing on improving our relative position. And eventually those military advantages, the ground realities, will translate into bargaining leverage that affect the negotiations. A second major hurdle is that, unfortunately, China continues to view the LAC as a source of coercive leverage over India. Chinese transgressions have been increasing for most of the last decade. And recent Chinese incursions that occurred in the Western sector were, most analysts posit, were very much connected to India's ongoing militarization of the LAC. India responding to China militarizing the LAC, building its own outposts in the Western sector, and China intervening with military force to try to prevent that, to compel India to stop doing that. A third big hurdle is that China doesn't accept the status quo. It doesn't want to do anything to enshrine the status quo. It withdrew its support from the package proposal to resolve the boundary dispute in the mid-1980s. It's since referred to the eastern sector as the biggest source of the dispute, a little bit problematic for resolving this. And the pockets of the dispute along the LAC have more than doubled since 1995. So the mid-1990s, there were about 8 locations on the LAC where there were major disputes. That's now risen to over 20 major disputes. Another hurdle that I have to at least acknowledge is Tibet. Chinese anxiety in regards to Tibet and Indian intentions remains very high. And then there's a final hurdle that India wants to continue to militarize the line of actual control because China has outpaced it. It's playing catch up, and it wants to improve its relative position. So any proposal, whether it's a more modest CBM or clarifying and respecting the LAC, that India might perceive would jeopardize its ongoing militarization and effort to play catch up, might not have support in Delhi. Okay, so very quickly, I want to highlight some disquieting trends. So I think this gets at why this strategic environment is changing and why China and India, even though in the last 20 years they haven't been able to do this, should start to think about moving towards clarifying and respecting the LAC. One is, as I said, the persistence of major incursions and prolonged standoffs along the line of actual control. There was a major confrontation in 1987, understudied in the literature, but at the time was quite serious. There were a lot of signaling types of comments from the Chinese premier at that time, warning India to back off. Major Chinese incursions in the Western sector in 2013 and 2014. The DOCLM incident in 2017. Happy to talk about more of that in the Q&A. There's also the trend of increasing Chinese assertiveness and risk-taking in regards to pressing its territorial ambitions and advancing them, not only in the South and East China Seas, but also with respect to Bhutan, also with respect to India. Rising national narratives on both sides, hyper-nationalistic medias. Chinese and Indian forces, as I've mentioned, are increasingly in frequent contact along the LAC. So in the past, when they were not in contact as much because the militarization was not quite as strong, you could maybe get by with having modest CBMs to control that situation. Can you get by with that when their military forces are closer and closer together in more frequent contact? Escalation dangers, of course, are on the rise with both China and India evolving their postures and doctrines. So both of them now have offensive military doctrines that envision capturing territory early in a conflict, especially in mountainous terrain where it's very hard to dislodge your adversary once they've occupied that terrain. Another concern along the LAC. And then, of course, the broader strategic competition that exists in Southern Asia. So despite all of this, why do I think China and India need to take this a little bit more seriously? Well, I think there are 3 compelling interlocking strategic interests for both countries that start to, as you play these out over the next 10, 20 years, get at why clarifying and respecting the LAC is actually in the interest of both countries. The first is that both countries need to enhance their economic cooperation. So at multiple points where China and India have had major confrontations along the LAC, there have been discussions about economic cooperation that have been scuttled as a result. So in 2014, right after Modi was elected, Xi went to India. They signed 12 agreements, including on trade, $20 billion in Chinese investments. But all of this was overshadowed because Chinese forces crossed the line of actual control in the Western sector. During the Doklam dispute, cross-boundary trade was disrupted majorly at different cross-border points. Foreign direct investment from China trickled and was used as a coercive lever. And so the main point here is that economic priorities are not served by prolonged standoffs. And the fact that the two countries had to have a summit in Wuhan just to get economic and other forms of cooperation back on track, I think is very telling. Because every time you need a summit just to get standard bilateral relationship back on track, there's an opportunity cost there of what could that diplomacy have been invested in had these standoffs not occurred. A second interest that I think both countries share is avoiding exogenous political shocks. So Xi, at the time of Doklam, was very concerned with the upcoming 19th Party Congress. And a lot of people believe part of the reason Doklam was resolved in the way it was that upcoming party Congress and the need to shore up his political support in advance. Modi, of course, has been very worried for the last couple of years about the upcoming parliamentary elections and what effect another prolonged standoff with China would have on his electoral prospects. And although scholars have found that China is a low salience issue in Indian electoral politics, I think what's happened since Doklam doesn't show that it's more salient, but it shows that at the elite level there are strong concerns. From what we know, Modi was very concerned about being embarrassed by China in the run-up to the elections, and that really motivated not only Wuhan, but a lot of the diplomacy and strategic room for maneuver that India has operated in for the last 2 years. A final interest is that China and India both need to avoid strategic distraction. They're both rising powers in the 21st century. In an era of great power competition, do they both really want to be dragged down by this dispute on the LAC? China historically has focused on addressing three vulnerabilities. Preventing domestic unrest, ensuring economic modernization, and parrying challenges from the U.S. And these vulnerabilities are what have often motivated China to reach out to its neighbors to improve diplomatic relations with India. And I think in an era of trade wars and strategic competition with the United States, China should really evaluate domestic unrest, economic modernization, challenges from the U.S. Can it afford to continue to have this troubled relationship with India? And if not, what can it do to improve that situation? I think that's even more the case if China continues to aggressively advance its territorial ambitions in the South and East China Seas. For India, avoiding strategic disruption means keeping the eyes on the prize, economic growth. And China's a big part of that. It also means for India protecting its cherished strategic autonomy, which I think it'll be able to do more deftly. It'll be able to pursue relations with the U.S. at a more moderate pace if some of these issues with China are addressed. Two thoughts in conclusion before Michael yanks me off the stage here. I want to mention what I think is a flawed logic of deferment. I referenced this earlier in my remarks. Shivshankar Menon has written that the fundamental reason the boundary alignment is taking so long is that both sides think that the time is on their side and that their relative position will improve over time. But the focus on relative positions obscures the bigger strategic picture. Prolonged standoffs are having serious economic, political, and strategic consequences. And the special representatives between China and India have already said they've completed the technical work, that it's just a political decision to resolve this dispute. And to me, that's even more reason to stop the prolonged standoffs that are hardening positions. These standoffs along the LAC are hardening positions, or making the politics harder. So why not do all we can to stop that from happening? So China and India need to recognize, as they did in the 90s, that the LAC is the basis for peace. Doing so would help ward off devastating conflict, inoculate their bilateral relationship from major disruptions, and facilitate the economic, political, and strategic imperatives of both countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Travis. So now you have a flavor of some of the initiatives that are found in this book. Toby's here. His essay, Modernize the South Asia Nuclear Facility Non-Attack Agreement, an outstanding idea. Harry Hanna is here, and his idea is to launch a hotline between national and nuclear command authorities in India and Pakistan to manage tensions. A very creative idea because we've always had this civil-military problem of communication between India and Pakistan, and the National Command and Nuclear Command authorities, you have both civil and military leaders involved. So I commend these essays to you. I commend others to you as well. For those of our authors who are watching the live stream from India and Pakistan, thank you for your contributions. They're appreciated. I loved working with all the nationalities here. And that's how I think we get progress. We obliterate national boundaries, at least in terms of the way we think. So, who would like to offer any kind of a comment or an exclamation mark? No, yes, sir. Please identify yourself, and I think we might even have a microphone for you. Hold on, because the live streaming thing, you need to be heard.
Thank you, Chair. This is Samir Ali Khan. I'm a visiting fellow at Atlantic Council. And once we were discussing this issue of international monitoring systems, which could potentially be installed in Pakistan and India. So once we look at the broader picture and look at how India has been arguing against NPT, that it is discriminatory, and later once they had the waiver, they were of the view that now we have the same responsibilities and rights as nuclear weapon states. So now once we go to CTBT, then they again find it discriminatory. I'm not saying that Pakistan doesn't find it so, but how do we deal with this larger issue of states who are outside the broader regime and they have a different view on the
Excellent
issue?
Question. Excellent question. Sylvia?
Thanks for a great question. Well, Pakistan has two planned seismic stations within its borders, the Rahim Khan and at Pari. Pakistan has linked its signature and ratification to that of India, right? So in our paper, we also argued that conversely, Pakistan can take a leading position and sign and ratify the CTBT, which would also put India under a lot of pressure to rethink its position on the CTBT and its engagement with the international monitoring system. One area where I do agree with you, a lot has changed since 1998. And in the last 2 decades, we now have a nuclear doctrine. We have agreed to a nuclear moratorium on nuclear testing. So the conditions that prevailed in 1998 and now, they are quite different. India is playing a more important role as a norms and rules shaper. So I do agree that there needs to be a clarification or a juxtaposition of its position on the CTBT, but it's just not the NPT. But in terms of CTBT, India also argues that the CTBT is not a fully comprehensive treaty because it does not look at the subcritical or eliminate the subcritical testing for a lot of countries, and some of the more advanced countries have advanced technologies to conduct subcritical testing. So yes, I do agree that more formulation from the Indian policymakers should come on why it still has not decided to engage with the CTBT. But before that, I also believe that there needs to be more education and discussion and conversation on the fact of nuclear testing both in Delhi and Islamabad. Thank you.
I love your idea with Sarah. Sylvia, it's so pragmatic and simple. India and Pakistan are two countries with great technological capability and monitoring capability. And they have sites that they could volunteer to help the international community monitor the absence of nuclear tests, which they've both sworn to uphold. So it's a brilliant idea. And waiting implementation. Colonel Smith, would you please identify yourself?
I'm Dave Smith. I'm a non-resident fellow here at Stimson. Before I ask a question, I would like to echo what Michael said. It's so great to see the professional growth among the young Stimson analysts. I've seen this going on for quite a few years now, and I won't say how many, but it's great to have Travis and Hannah, who I've interacted with in the past, showing such growth and scholarly maturity. So my question is this. I'm going to assume that all of these chapters were written before February. And since February, I'm referring now to the Pulwama incident between Pakistan and India, I'm just wondering if your conclusions are affected by what you've seen play out between the two countries since February. Is this a temporary blip in bilateral relations, or is this a further poisoning of the well that makes cooperation impractical for a very long time on issues like this? And I guess I would extend that to Toby and Harry if they would like to answer as well.
I can have a quick go at that. I would say that from an environmental diplomacy perspective, actually, this kind of crisis can provide an opportunity where others are going to be less possible, because environmental diplomacy creates a face-saving exit strategy for de-escalation, where you don't have to concede any of the other hard politics issues, but it allows for trust building to take place. So oftentimes, if you approach these issues, particularly within the context of some of the other broader conversations which are happening on environmental agreements, such as right now on the Climate Change Treaty, that can itself be very positive. So, for example, there is a mechanism which was set up by the Dutch government where they have brought in military professionals from South Asia together to look at climate change cooperation. And they've had very senior officials from Pakistani, Indian, and Bangladeshi military as well, meeting regularly focused on climate change issues, even with all the other tensions that are happening. So I would say your concern is well taken, but from the point of view of my chapter, I think it's actually an opportunity.
I'll echo that. The conclusions that my attempt to push my proposal in the field, they haven't changed. I didn't get to them in my remarks because I was trying to stop, but basically there is already precedence for information sharing in South Asia. So we know that there's been enough political salience in the past, it's been of use in the past, which means it could be of use again in the future. The second sort of conclusion that my colleagues and I came to was that we're in an era where I don't think bilateral anything will ever have, it's not going to have salience, at least in the near term. And so any kind of proposal like this, I think the ones that will float are the ones that are multilateral in their nature, and that has to do with South Asia's politics specifically, but also just where we're at right now, whether you're calling it the second nuclear age or the third nuclear age, depending on who you're talking to. It's multipolar, and it needs to have more than two parties with the U.S. or China trying to push them together. And then the third sort of finding that we had that I think holds true after Balakot and Pulwama is that political timing is critical, and in the past when agreements have been pushed through, it's either been because there was a crisis that got really bad, and maybe this one wasn't bad enough, I don't know, or because the agreement got tied onto some other sort of political initiative, like India pursuing a 1-2-3 agreement, or India and Pakistan's bids over the years to try and join the nuclear suppliers group. So I think my proposal and some of the other ones in this book, if they got attached onto something else as a part of a larger sort of political push, we could see something. And I know Michael has an answer to your question. Are you going to give him?
You've given them my answer.
Well, post-election. No one said post-election. There could be space after the election.
Toby, do you want to put your 2 cents worth into this conversation? Because you have long been frustrated by the lack of progress, and yet here you are, making another useful suggestion.
I'm a glutton for punishment, I guess. I think it's important to be optimistic and to find reasons for optimism despite the prevailing problems. And so that's why I was happy to contribute what I thought was a modest proposal to expand the scope and practice associated with exchanging lists of nuclear facilities. And so just let me make three points. First, I think related to the issue of the sort of participation in the CTBT IMS system and the NPT and kind of broader international organizations, there are no audience costs for leaderships in India and Pakistan for taking positions that are not useful internationally, but because there's no institutional mechanism in which to hold them accountable, there's just no follow-up, right? They don't have to do anything. There's no cost at home. And so I'm curious actually to read Arca's chapter and hear about the humanitarian dialogue. If there are domestic movements that can begin to impose audience costs on leaders for not taking useful positions on things internationally, then that would be good. And that is one way to build domestic support for unilateral restraints or reciprocal restraints, or however you want to frame them. Second thing I would say, and this is related to what we've seen over the last couple of months, and perhaps Harry would say more in particular about the importance of clarifying information as it relates to signaling and so forth. I think we see coming out of this crisis or episode or whatever you want to call it, I hesitate to call it a crisis. That's probably worth another workshop on another day. But I think that there's an emergence of some sense of subsequent thresholds for escalation. And that in itself can be a useful thing if there's ways to codify norms in that respect. And so that's where it circles back to the suggestion that I had made, that there ought to be norms about things that are targeted in future limited conflict, right? And that expanding that norm and translating that into military doctrine would be a useful thing to do.
Harry, do you want to add any 2 cents worth?
I would just add that in a general rule, Pulwama follows a pattern of past incidents from Uri and Pathankot. So generally I'm a pessimist on bilateral relations. However, like a train, they come along periodically and you jump on them when you want them to occur. And I think that the command and control relationship, or the hotline, is something that is out there, that we've always wrestled with, this civil-military split between India and Pakistan in decision-making. And this is a proposal to try to simplify or bridge that issues. Going back to the Cold War experience, though, both countries will have to probably experience a crisis of need, just as we did in 1962 with the Soviet Union, that we need to do this. I tried to write my proposal or idea so that it's actually both in their own national interest. They're not doing it as a favor to India and Pakistan, and vice versa.
You know, I just learned in working on a book on the rise and demise and revival of nuclear arms control. I learned for the first time that the hotline idea originated in 1960. And Gerard Smith, who was then a State Department official, policy planning, and Henry Owen came up with it and asked President Eisenhower to consider it. But the timing wasn't right. As you said, the timing was right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. If we had the foresight to do it early on, we wouldn't have had to rely on Western Union to convey messages to Moscow during that crisis. Toby Dalton referred to an essay by Arka Biswas in this volume, a very accomplished young Indian expert, to establish a joint India-Pakistan initiative on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. Great idea. And we also have an essay by Sarah Bano, a Canadian colleague, to convene a joint commission on the consequences of nuclear war in South Asia, which, again, I highly recommend these ideas. There are a lot of them in here. Well, Mr. Program Director. Harry, go ahead.
I had one question actually for Hannah. In her discussions with people around the world, was there much interest in trying to involve the major insurance industry and reinsurance industry in the information about the civilian nuclear stockpiles of countries?
That is a great question. That was not in any way part of our discussions, but the Stimson Center's Safeguards and Nuclear Security Program have a really cool project that you should check out called the Template for, somebody help me, Global Governance Template. Thank you. Heather Byrne with the information. And they are doing that. They're harnessing industry, legal representation, and working directly with plants to incentivize nuclear security at a sort of ground-based level.
Samir.
So for someone to say thank you all for excellent contributions to a fantastic volume that I think is going to be in real demand right now as policymakers, hopefully in South Asia, but also I think in the United States, are seriously thinking about new ideas to put on the table to get conversations started, even if these don't sort of come to fruition. The conversation's useful. So, Travis, as I was listening to your remarks, I was thinking about something, and then it sort of backed into a larger question. So the initial reaction was, if India and China really were able to get their act together and resolve the demarcation of the LAC, would that be in U.S. geopolitical interests right now? Do we really want India to be able to settle a dispute with China when in the long run we really want India to help us balance China? And so that led me to a larger question, which is, to what degree do states prefer not to share information or not resolve issues? To what degree do they prefer not to do that because it keeps their adversary off balance and that serves their geopolitical interests? Obviously, there are benefits to this if this is a functionalist problem, if this is a coordination dilemma. But what if states just fundamentally think that in a hyper-realist world, giving anything away is dangerous and not worth the risk? I wonder if you've had time to think a little bit about that and reflect. What are the reasons? What would you say to those states?
I expected a good question from you. Appreciate that. So let me attempt to answer. I think, there are arguments on both sides of this disputed frontier and U.S. interests benefiting from it or, coming out on the negative side. I think that any bet that the U.S. makes on India, being any kind of counterbalance to China or just a net security provider in the Indian Ocean, depends on the fundamental transformation in the relationship between China and India. So, if you look at Indian Army, Indian military, highly land-centric orientation, that has a lot of follow-on effects, like a lot of money, like maintaining a very large Indian Army, a lot of personnel costs. All of that then crowds out investments in capital expenditures. There's the opportunity cost of being able to invest in the Indian Navy, which is barely getting 15% of the budget on an annual basis. So I think that's the first issue. Secondly, if you're the U.S. looking at India, do you want China to have a veto on India's foreign policy? Because I think in a lot of ways right now China does have a veto on India's foreign policy. There are understandable reasons why Indian leaders have moderated its policy towards China. And I think a lot of that makes sense, and there was probably a need for a moderation after a lot of tension over a 3-4 year period leading up to the Doklam crisis. But I don't know if it's healthy for India to telegraph to Beijing every time we're entering parliamentary elections, we need quiet on the LAC and quiet on the frontier for 2 years. And we're going to sacrifice X, Y, and Z things in our diplomacy and in our strategic interest to do so. And that's also why I don't really look at the Azhar designation or listing on the UN Sanctions 1267 Committee. I don't look at that as a game changer of any kind. I think China, if you look at it really, China gave up nothing. It took a load off of its back. This was becoming a more troublesome issue for China. But really, did China have to give something up to allow that designation to move forward? And what did India fundamentally gain from that? I think there are a lot of questions. So I think, again, if you think about India becoming a major player in the Indian Ocean, becoming a true counterbalancer to China, and you think about this problem of China always having a veto over Indian foreign policy, I don't think it's in the U.S. interest to let this state of affairs go forward. And as I explained, I think China, China, at some point, I don't think China will be able to rise in the way it wants to rise, challenge the norms in the way that it wants to challenge them, win every match on the board in terms of its territorial ambitions. And I think if you look at, and I'm not a Chinese policymaker, but if you look at their interests, I think they have more vital interests in other parts of the world, including closer to their neighborhood, including in the East and South China Sea. And at some point, there's going to have to be a triage on the Chinese side. I think the U.S. might have some additional challenges arise from that in terms of its own military posture in East Asia, but I think the U.S. can live with that changed state of affairs.
I have just a quick point on this. Excellent question as well. In terms of, if you look at it more broadly in political geography, there is definitely a dominant literature which suggests that physical proximity of neighbors ultimately leads to some degree of cooperation, and that geography is destiny kind of argument. So in that way, China-India cooperation at some level is going to be much more inevitable. And so similarly, China-Russia cooperation also is going to be more inevitable at some level. But that can be challenged, and there can be roadblocks in the way, and so on and so forth. On the environmental side, and I have done work in China for many years on the environmental side of the story, the U.S. has always played the environmental card in terms of a lot of trade-related issues with China, but we had a situation with the rare earths crisis in 2012, where China was saying, well, we're closing our rare earths production because we have problems with the environment, and the U.S. took China to the WTO for a dispute around that, saying that you're unfairly increasing the price of rare earths. So, China's environmental arguments, which it had been criticized for in terms of pollution, were used reversely by the U.S. So you do have strange dynamics which play out there. But in terms of the China-India relationships, if you look at issues around river basins with the Brahmaputra situation as well, all those factors ultimately will require some level of engagement, which is extent of whatever U.S. interests might be.
I am going to call the proceedings to a halt. I want to thank our contributors and our speakers. I want to thank folks from long distances who are not able to join us, but who helped put this excellent book together. These books are available free of charge because of funding support we get from the Carnegie Corporation in New York, the MacArthur Foundation, and the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is part of the Department of Energy, and very much involved in constructive work to prevent proliferation. So thanks to everybody, including Ziba and Kirk, for organizing this event, especially Ziba. Her maiden organizational effort, Ms. Stimson. You can find this book on our website, www.stimson.org. Please download it. Take care. Thank you all.